What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some thoughts as well as just general information about Gothic Remake after I got to play the game for quite a bit of time, actually. And so, of course, we've got a lot to go over here. But first and foremost, I am able to bring you this video because several weeks back, at like the beginning of April, actually, THQ Nordic via a PR company reached out, asked if I wanted to take a look at it. At the same time, they did that initial preview for some of the expanded content they did, which I also made a video on. That, however, was hands-off. This was a hands-on experience. I have played a good chunk of the beginning of the game for myself, and so obviously I want to set some qualifiers for everything I had access to. So essentially what this was a specific build they made available to a handful of people that basically gave you access to roughly the first 5 or so hours of the game. In particular, the game's open world was sort of fenced off with an invisible wall covering both the introductory area, old camp and its immediate surroundings, as well as some of the paths up to the old mine where you would do some of the initial quests. Now, if you've never played Gothic and none of that made any sense to you, this is probably also a good place to mention that this video has to both address people who have played and are familiar with Gothic and also people who are looking at this for the very first time, so keep in mind this might be a little bit all over the place. I do apologize for that. However, I have in fact played the original Gothic. It was a game I enjoyed quite a bit, even though I got to it very late in comparison to its initial release back in 2001. But I have a few notes, as you would imagine. So let's start with the broad strokes. Main thing I want to get across here is that this definitely feels like Gothic, and you notice that straight away. And I think they did a really good job in including some of the core components of that, while also obviously changing things via the remake, which we'll get into a little bit. But things like really feeling that progression of initially being thrown into the colony, knowing nothing, and then getting your first bits of progression via learning how to use a weapon properly, and then your first couple of levels giving you some health and you being able to take on enemies that would have just one-shotted you even just a little bit ago is still there. I also think they did a great job with the, not exactly reimagining, but perhaps giving the world a fresh coat of paint while retaining some of the immersion. So one of the things I really loved about the original Gothic was how that world felt to maneuver around. For as old as it was, it had an incredible atmosphere. And I did see that here in this preview. I can't speak to all of it, obviously, only had access to so much, but walking through the woods at night in this particular game is a rough situation, especially at the beginning, because it is very dark, and while you can get light and things from the moon or a torch, obviously, that doesn't give you perfect vision, and if you run into a wolf at a low level, you're just dead. So that kind of leading into you needing to understand your surroundings, and that feeling is still there, and I'm happy to see that. However, on the flip side of that, I also think this is obviously introducing some changes that I think are going to wind up being a little controversial for the old diehards. Like, for instance, they've added difficulty options. We're going to get into that. They've also adjusted some of the quests to accommodate for things that are no longer relevant. Just to give a quick example, in the original Gothic, you had to learn how to sneak. That's not something you could do just by default. In Gothic Remake, it is. And so there's an introductory quest that in the original would have seen you learning how to sneak, and that was more or less the focus of the quest. But here, that quest has been altered because you no longer need to learn how to sneak. And that stuff, in combination with the addition of the new content we know that they've added but have only seen a little bit of, remains to be seen how well that content both fits in and, how good it actually is. But let's take this one thing at a time here. Let's talk about the technical state. How was this running? Happy to say that at least for me here in this preview, it ran quite well. I actually didn't have really any issues with running the game itself, and that was certainly up for debate. The very, very original demo, when they were first floating the idea of making this game at all, they put out that initial sort of proof of concept demo that was very rough. The Nyrus prologue, which is the current demo, is also not exactly the most optimized experience and is really just meant to introduce the core concepts. So to be honest, I went into this expecting it to be a little choppy, and it was actually a pretty smooth experience. I will say I did have a quest bug out on me. You were meant to go gather some things. I gathered all of them. The quest even updated that all I had to do was go talk to the guy again, and it just refused to proceed from there. So hopefully that will be fixed in the final release, but it's my understanding that all they're really doing at this point is in fact polishing everything, so with any luck that will be the case. I still wanted to mention it though. but obviously we'll see how it runs for everybody else when it is released to a wider set of hardware on June 5th. Next up, I mentioned difficulty options. What's that about? Obviously that's something we need to talk about, and so let's do that. It looks like what they've essentially done is made the baseline Gothic experience normal, or Gothic difficulty, and then they've added one below that called novice, one above that called hard, alongside custom difficulty settings. Now, I gotta be honest with you guys, this is one that I feel a little on the fence about. I'm not necessarily opposed to adding a harder situation, like via hard mode and stuff. However, I do think this is the kind of game where the progression from being a weak nobody who dies immediately to this absolute powerhouse of a hero who is almost functionally unkillable is just part of the experience. You're meant to be very weak in the beginning, and then you become ridiculously overpowered if you put in the work. And I do feel like adding an easy mode to this specific game that they made this experience for, even all the way back then, is kind of a detriment to that. So I don't love that there's an easier difficulty here. But it looks like what these difficulties actually affect is combat, as well as the availability of resources from things via like traders, etc., like how prices and things fluctuate, and how much experience you are gaining for progression and the like. There is a permadeath option. I'm not exactly sure what close combat flow helper actually does. I think it is meant to help you with comboing. Difficulty out of the way, however, now let's talk about the rest of the game. So I'm going to jump around a little here. This is because this next part won't be new information if you have played the game, but I do kind of want to set the stage for people who have not played it and are looking to jump into the remake to play the game for the first time. If you are unaware, the story of Gothic follows a set character, an unnamed hero known as, believe it or not, the Nameless Hero. There is not a character creation, this is just the guy you are playing, and you start the game with this guy about to get tossed into a prison colony, which doesn't have any way of you getting back out. However, as this is about to happen, a mage shows up and gives you a letter to give to the fire mages in the colony, basically kind of implying that you might be able to bargain your way out of the colony if you do this for him. But what is this prison colony? Well, you see, the kingdom at large is at war with orcs who are invading from all sides, and they need to mine as much of the magic ore that they can in order to make weapons to fight this war. They intended to set up this colony to force people to do that, and they tried to set up a barrier to contain the people within, but something went wrong with its construction, which resulted in people being able to go in and pass this barrier, but if anything tries to go out, the barrier murders them. So goods can travel back and forth, but living things cannot. Now this made a bit of a problem for the kingdom because their initial idea was to, of course, impose their own rule over the place, but as things stand, the prisoners in the colony are essentially ruling themselves. However, there is a bit of a shaky alliance where they are still mining and shipping ore out to the kingdom in exchange for the goods and things they need to actually survive, and this has led, of course, to the very uneasy situation we find ourselves in. However, the mining colony is a very unfriendly place, as you find out by waking up and getting punched in the face, recreating that original intro. And I want to use that moment to both talk about progression and perhaps then explain why the novice difficulty I don't think should be here, but also talk about the wider setting. Now, the thing you need to understand is that what makes Gothic Gothic is that you are thrown into a place like this colony and you are extraordinarily weak. Basically anything can kill you with extreme ease, and your job is to basically do the things you can do, put up with the things you have to put up with, until you get strong enough to do something about it. And so while you start the game as this weak little guy who gets murdered by mole rats, you turn into a character that is functionally unkillable if you're not terrible. The game shows this progression in a lot of ways, but basically as you level up, you're going to earn learning points, and if you take those learning points alongside some money, most like, in fact everybody trades an ore, so that's kind of the currency here, and that ore and your learning points find a trainer and you can either increase your stats or learn techniques. Increasing stats is helpful. You basically have strength and dex that you can increase manually, magic as well, but that's more of a late game thing. Strength is melee weapons, dexterity is ranged weapons, and those are going to increase your raw power as well as give you the ability to equip better versions of those corresponding items. However, what it won't do is make you good at using them. This is where some of that training comes in. One of the cool things that even the original Gothic did was that it functionally changed how your character attacked by giving you this training. So in the beginning of the game, you're trying to use one-handed swords with two hands, you're swinging super slowly, you can't do any combos, but once you find a trainer and learn to be trained in that particular type of weapon, there's a bunch of trainers for each type, it literally makes using that weapon type easier, both by giving you faster attacks, allowing you to combo, allowing you to parry, things like that, and just giving you more options. You don't get shields here, by the way, you block with regular weaponry. Now the big thing here is combos. You have a bunch of attacks by default, your basic attack, but you can also do like overheads or piercing stabs, that kind of thing, which are fine, but slow. Once you get trained in a weapon, you can start performing combos. Once you master a weapon, you can combo and then perform a finisher at the end. This is actually something the game does to get you more into the idea of attacking and approaching combat slowly. In fact, button mashing is never a good idea because you can fail to combo even if you are in fact trained. But basically, as you attack and that attack ends, if you then click instead of button mashing, you can lead yourself into a combo. And this is of course a more efficient way of dealing with enemies because you're more likely to stagger them. It's again faster, so you're hitting them more often without getting hit. And then take that alongside with both enemy attack patterns, as each enemy in the game has its own sort of way of approaching combat and the like. Like for instance, scavengers love to do like this head down charge thing, goblins love to throw things at you, etc, etc. But then you start getting some variety in, and you start understanding how to deal with it, and you can start to master these things a little bit. But in order to do any of that, you've got to put up with the less than savory denizens of the camps. Now I only had access to the old camps here, so I can't speak to new camp or the swamp camp, which if you don't know are the factions you're going to have to join to progress the story. You can only join one per playthrough, and it affects some of the stuff available to you. One thing I'll be curious to see in the end is whether or not they added any unique content, because one of the problems the original Gothic had is that it was very front-loaded. You had to join these factions to advance the story, but like once you joined the factions, that was pretty much it. All the work was, kind of put into joining them and not much after that. Outside of course, just the main story stuff. So I'll be curious to see if they expand any of that. But the old camp is, of course, the main camp, as the name would imply. And they are the ones functionally carrying out the mining of all the ore and everything, and you can go visit the mines and get an idea of their whole operation. Whereas the new camp and the swamp camp have different ideas. The new camp has the water mages and the mercenary types, and they are actively looking for a way to blow up the barrier to get out by stockpiling the ore instead of trading it. The swamp camp are a bunch of lunatics who are smoking swamp weed, as it is called, though the original just called it weed in the English version, which was super funny to me. But they do call it swamp weed this time around. Swamp weed basically gets these guys high while also allowing them to tap into more magical powers, and they have sort of been in contact with what they are calling the Sleeper, who they believe will lead them to freedom. But there's also a group of orcs that call this colony home as well. I got a good look at them via a captured one in the mines, despite not being able to journey to their actual territory. Not that you'd want to, you'd get obliterated at the beginning. And they look, more or less like orcs, as you would probably expect. But the other thing I want to talk about is stuff on the world side of things. So something the remake was intending to do was expand some of the living world from the original. So believe it or not, despite when it released, the original Gothic, all the way back in 2001, predating things like Morrowind, etc., actually had like a sandbox open world with NPCs that had like schedules and reactions, etc. It was genuinely very impressive for the time given the context. All the way here in 2026, they wanted to, of course, improve upon that, and they've done that in a few ways. But I will say things like that have become increasingly more common since the original. So outside of like the original flavor of Gothic and the way the game sort of beats you down in a way I'm sure people will compare to something like Morrowind in the end, these are nonetheless systems that you will have seen before, like how the justice system works. For instance, when you, say, get caught stealing, or if an NPC attacks you, they don't generally try to kill you. What they'll do is knock you out and potentially take some of your stuff, and then you can just get back up after that. And you'll do the same to those NPCs typically when you attack them if you want to. This will, of course, trigger reactions from the surrounding people. Guildmates or people who are helping that character or like them will attack you if they see their friend being attacked, and vice versa. Guild areas are generally considered trespassing if you try to get in there. However, it's not all bad. You have a surprising amount of leeway here. For instance, if you get caught stealing, you can actually drop the items and they'll usually let the infraction go if they don't just attack you outright, like say a guard or something does see it. But if you get caught trying to pick a chest or something, you can just stop and they'll usually leave you alone, that kind of thing. But they've also expanded this to some other areas, like, for instance, how the traders manage their goods, how the world reacts to things like corpses, etc. So there's a decay system now. As you defeat animals, they don't respawn necessarily. So when the chapter resets, things will spawn in and change a little bit as the game is divided into chapters. But for the most part, those animals will die and then decompose, and that's kind of it, and you'll kind of see that happen, which is a certainly interesting element that adds to the atmosphere, I think. But I wanted to mention that because if you've ever played the Gothic games, you know animals are actually a valuable resource for you if you have the skills to harvest them. One of the earliest trainers you can find is a guy who will teach you how to take things like teeth and hides, etc. from the animals you kill, which you can then sell for ore, which is an incredibly lucrative way to fund your adventures. Learning how to do that has a high ore cost, but a low learning point cost, which means you'll want to try to do that quickly so you can make use of the animals you are killing. But that's just one of the ways the game tries to really drive home, outside of things like NPC schedules, etc., what is going on here and what kind of world you are in, as it makes it feel a little more like an ecosystem. But speaking of stuff like that, I mentioned the traders. So what is that about? So traders in this game have their own sort of system of buying and selling, which is more or less how they regenerate their own inventory. As you sell things to a merchant, they will actually sell that excess inventory, which is how they get their ore stockpiles back. Meaning that over time, they'll of course have ore to trade with you so you can continue to sell things. Now they use the ore they get to actually restock everything that they normally sell, prioritizing crafting materials and consumables. One really interesting thing though is that the prices you will get fluctuate based on what the merchant has. So as you sell more and more of something to a merchant, the value of that item starts to go down, meaning you won't get necessarily the full amount. So that's especially noteworthy when mass selling herbs or trophies and things from animals, and that seems to affect the general area. The more of that item you introduce to the local economies you will be interacting with, the less valuable it becomes. I'm sure many of you know how supply and demand works, and it's basically that just introduced into the system here, and I thought that was a really interesting touch to the world. But speaking of buying and selling, one of the first things you'll either want to buy or perhaps coerce someone into giving you is a map. One of the ways this game tries to drive home how difficult it can be is that you have to earn your map. It's not hard to find. The game more or less pushes you towards the old camp, and then literally the first house on your right as you enter the old camp will have a guy who will sell you a map. But it doesn't end there. You see, there are actually multiple maps, and having more and more of them adds to your available map. You'll get maps that will mark specific locations, which you can check or uncheck on your main map to see where they are. And you can also get further maps for individual areas, like the old camp specifically, for instance, that will switch as you move in. But to sort of start drawing this video to a close and getting across my main points here, I want to say that this game feels like Gothic to me. I think they really nailed the core ideas, at least on Gothic difficulty, of being this weak nobody, slowly gaining power, making your place in the world, and immersing yourself in that world, and the feeling of accomplishment and progression that comes with that. For instance, getting your first bit of armor is a really big deal. I like the little elements that they've taken to expand what's available here. I'm very curious to see that play out over the course of the entire game, obviously. I enjoy that the game seems to run pretty well for me thus far, other than that one bugged quest, and I think the atmosphere is still there and enjoyable. However, they've also clearly made some not insubstantial changes that I don't think everybody's gonna love. I personally don't think there should be a novice difficulty. I appreciate that this remake is going to bring in a bunch of people new to the game, and 99% of the time I am super pro difficulty options, and if you want to play novice, do you. It's not that big a deal to me personally, but I will say the experience that they are intending to give you is the baseline Gothic difficulty. And I would actually go so far as to argue that if you are not going to play on that one, you're not getting the true experience of what this game is meant to be about. All in all, though, I would say this is mostly looking very good. I'm excited to play the rest of it when it gets closer to release, as I really want to play and experience everything that they have done here. But for today, that is pretty much going to do it. Hope you enjoyed this early look at Gothic Remake. If you're looking forward to the review, by all means, subscribe and stick around, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.